Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the third lecture of PI Summer School. My name is Tanya, and I'm the editorial coordinator at Progressive International. Today, we are so fortunate to have among us Dr. Jodi, the foremost political theorist of our time, and the author of books such as The Communist Horizon, Crowds and Parties, and Comrade, an essay on political belonging. She's also involved in anti-capitalist grassroots and international struggles around climate, gender, and racial. In today's lecture, Dr. Dean will address some of the crucial themes revolving around labor and class. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Dean, and over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to see so many people from all over the world coming into our discussion today. I'm going to share the screen so you'll get a little bit of a sense of what we'll be talking about today. And let's hope that this works. Here we go. And share. And great. So today's class is going to be on work and labor. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. I'm not going to kind of worry about, one means one thing, one means the other. My comments are going to follow this outline today. And so this is useful for structuring your notes or your thinking. Someone might even want to write and put it in the chat, but I'll start with thinking about our intuitions about work, like what is it, like just our kind of common everyday understandings. Then I'll look specifically at the Marxist or historical materialist approach to work, because work is more than our subjective feeling about it. Then I will spend a lot of time on work kind of pre-capitalist, prior to capitalism, outside of capitalism, so that we get a sense of like what capitalism destroys and presupposes. And then we'll look at labor under capitalism and end up with thinking about work under imperialist conditions. I've got a bit of a cough. I hope it doesn't end up being like disgustingly annoying. So anyway, that's what we'll be doing today. It'll probably be around, roughly an hour, and then we'll have discussion. Okay, let's see. So
Jodi, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I'm going to start then with our intuitions about work. People might even want to write some of this down in your, in the chat. Like, what do you think about when you first think about work? Like, what comes to mind? I mean, lots of times, the first thing that comes to mind is something that we have to do but don't want to do. Like, it's work if we really don't want to do it. And that's not totally wrong. Especially this have to part, right? There's something about work that we tend to associate with coercion, like with necessity. We have to do it. So there's a way that our everyday sense of work is something where work is opposed to freedom, like work is the opposite of freedom. Work is something like drudgery. But just saying that work is what we have to do, even though we don't want to, it leaves out a lot, right? Like it leaves out the creative parts of work, right? The kind of fulfillment we might get from making a pie or weeding a garden or taking care of a child or like making a guitar. It also leaves out the ways that even if it's not super fun, there can be a kind of satisfaction in producing something and in working with other people, right? Work is a primary social location where we interact with others. And so just calling it drudgery doesn't, and just thinking that it's unfree, doesn't let us kind of express or explore the social aspects of labor, right? Where we engage others and engage the world. So we've got this kind of like dilemma. There seems that there's more to work than just coercion and drudgery. It's a source of fulfillment. But then it's like, well, if we like what we do, then is it not work? Right? It's like, oh, like liking it is automatically makes it not work. And I don't think that's accurate, but I often think that that's how we feel about it. What I hope that these first kind of initial explorations let us know is that just our subjective feeling isn't enough. right? That's not enough to tell us about what work is. Liking it, not liking it, feeling happy about it, feeling alienated, feeling dreary, right? Like that's not enough. We need to go further. So how do we go further? How do we go beyond the subjective? Well, we can start thinking more about production, about when we make something. Right, that clearly making something, that work has something to do with making things. But as soon as we go there, it's like, okay, sure, that seems right. But is then the little kid who's using Legos and building a little house with their Legos or their blocks, is that work? Or if I make a sandcastle at the beach, am I working? What if I'm making an ice cream sundae? Is that working? Well, you know, if I'm making it for me, if I'm making it for a customer, like how is the making now relating or producing related to being work? What if I knit myself and my kids sweaters? If they have to have these sweaters, is that work? Or is it not work if I'm doing it for fun? Like, how do we know? So there's something about the productivity, about the productive activity on its own that's also not enough, right? Like to tell us about whether or not something is work. And then to keep going to try to complicate this for us, we should be really attuned to all of the work that goes into keeping us clean and fed and rested and sheltered, right? We might do a lot of this for ourselves, or we might share it with someone else, but then, you know, who made the sheets, right? Who crafted the bed? Who built the house, or who maintains the apartment building? When we were little kids, other people took care of us. Other people made it possible to survive. And other people still do this for us now, right? Other people always that we don't even see are making our very survival possible. And it's also the case that many of us, probably every one of us, it's to some extent, takes care of other people, whether or not it's preparing their food or bathing them or driving them where they need to go, or even, you know, listening to them and attending to their concerns. People might want to think a little bit about how the term work shows up in everyday language. In some English kind of slang or vernacular, and I don't know if it's just where I live in upstate New York, I think this is pretty common. If you're at a restaurant, the server might come and ask you, oh, and she'll look at your plate, or he'll look at your plate and say, oh, are you still working on that? So eating the meal is like a kind of work. Or another expression is that exercise is associated with working out. Sometimes people call listening to a tedious friend emotional work. Now, if you write a poem, is that work? If you love writing poems, is writing the poem work? If you get paid for writing poems, is the poem work? If you upload the poem to a website where some billionaire makes a profit from all the data that's on it, then is it work? Is it money that makes something work? But then it seems like so much labor is unpaid. So how do we deal with that? Finally, the last bit of like to try to make our sense of work kind of strange or unclear or troubled, we need to keep in mind all the relations in which an activity takes place, right? The way that the work of many, like countless others from all over the world, always makes everything that any one of us does possible, right? So all of us are sitting in front of a phone or some kind of laptop or computer. So we're nested in a global web of labor, from child cobalt miners in Congo to textile workers in Bangladesh, Turkey, and Vietnam, like who made the clothes that I think most of us are probably wearing. If we're anybody drinking coffee, right, then that coffee could be from Brazil, right? It could be grown by day laborers who work under slave-like conditions. Then if you think about your coffee, like, so if it was kind of cultivated and farmed by day laborers in Brazil, then it's processed, shipped, processed again, packaged, loaded into some kind of containers, shipped, stocked, purchased, and then turned into coffee, right? I actually don't know if we can even imagine how many people make possible at this point in our sort of global economic lives, how many people actually make possible every single thing that we do.
Hey, Jodi, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
So sorry. We can see your entire screen, including your notes, and not just the presentation.
Okay, how do I do that?
So when you go to share my screen, just select the PowerPoint.
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop share and start all over. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So
No, not at all.
stop share. Now go to more. Now go to share again. And now this is screen PowerPoint slide here, right?
Yeah.
How is it now?
Oh yeah, now we can see the PowerPoint.
Yay. Okay. Well, I'm not going to start all over because it was introduction anyway, just to get people's juices flowing. But thanks, Tanya, for getting this straightened up.
No, not at all.
All right. So I've been thinking about all of these kinds of complications about work and the subjective feelings about work and different ways to approach it. Now I want to zoom in on a Marxist approach to work, because a Marxist approach emphasizes the relations in which our activities are situated. For a Marxist approach, labor is a relationship. It's a relationship between people and the material world, right? That is, people and the natural world, in which we produce and have to produce the conditions for our survival, right? We're not turtles or snails who have shells, right? We have to produce the conditions for our survival. As Marx says, labor is first of all a process between man and nature. It involves purposeful activity. It involves the object on which work is performed, and it involves the tools or instruments of labor. And so work really involves like three things for Marx, like just starting out, right? And it's a process between man and nature. It involves purposeful activity. It involves the object on which our work or activity is performed. And it involves the tools or instruments that we use in this activity. And tools are particularly interesting because, especially as they develop over time, but tools are neat because they're a product of labor, right? We make tools and they're also instruments of labor. So they have this neat double character. And of course, all of this is collective. Right, all as in we are social beings. It's our work is always done in relation to others. So the very idea that labor is a relationship, it makes us have to ask a whole bunch of other questions, right? Questions about our relations to others, right? About other workers, other people. That labor is a relation also makes us have to think about questions of hierarchy, right? Is work arranged in an egalitarian way or a hierarchical way? It makes us have to think about the division of labor, right? Like who's doing what and why, right? If we're making a pie, does one person make the whole pie or does one person make the crust and somebody else make the filling? Or, if we're making a garden, does everyone do all of it together or do we divide up the different tasks? So division, once we recognize that labor is a relationship, we can't but think about the division of labor. And then we also can't but think about like, well, who owns it or who benefits from it? And so we're immediately pushed into thinking about class. The other important thing here, once we recognize that labor is a relationship in this, is that we're immediately pushed to recognize that work has a history. It's not everywhere and always the same, right? There's cultural differences. There's political differences in that there's different groups, different arrangements of people, whether or not we're talking about individuals or communities or states, different or ethnic groups or races. Different groups have different capacities to exercise coercive power So when we're starting to think about work as having a history, we always have to situate it in these other contexts, right? These contexts of coercion and change. You know, as we're going to see, for a Marxist approach or a historical materialist approach, it's the changes in labor, right? The changes in how work is arranged, how it's carried out, the social relations that enable it and that it enables. This actually is history from a historical materialist approach. So then to just kind of sum up this first set of reflections on our intuitive approach to labor, you know, for Marxists, work is not straightforward and obvious. Work involves people's relationship to the world and each other. And these relationships have a history. So we can't just look at one activity and say, this is work or it's not work, right? That's not a historical materialist approach. You don't just say, oh, here, this activity is work, or no, it's not, right? It's not like driving a car is automatically work or not work. It's not like even making a chair is automatically work or not work. There's a whole series of questions that have to be posed that are crucial to answer. And in fact, historical materialism is a method for posing and answering these questions. And I'm going to go into this historical materialist method. Okay, let's start with Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Engels says, according to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of the immediate essentials of life. And here, materialistic conception means historical materialism. It doesn't mean like, oh, some sort of bourgeoisie, oh, I'm like a material girl and really materialist and like just want stuff. It means historical materialism. So what Engels is saying is that how humans produce and reproduce the immediate essentials of life is what drives history. History is not what great men do. It's not first and foremost about wars and states. The movement of history comes from people's productive and reproductive activities. It's pushed by changes in how we produce and reproduce the essentials of life. So, do we search for food? Do we grow our own food? Do we force someone else to grow our food? Do we buy food? Do we ship food in from far-flung parts of the world? Right? These are questions of history. These are the kinds of things that drive history. Or we can do the same thing around energy. And there's like really brilliant work on how changes in energy sources are, real drivers of history, right? So do we, what kind of fuel are we relying on? Are we relying on wood? Are we relying on steam, coal, oil, nuclear? Like all of these different forms of energy have entire social and political structures that arise from them. So just like different ways of producing food can configure different modes of life, so do different ways of supplying energy. Now, when Engels is mentioning here this production and reproduction of the immediate essentials, I'm going to stay here, the immediate essentials of life, what we can see here is that he actually has in mind two kinds of processes, right? Productive and reproductive. So productive processes refer to our means of existence, like what we need to live, right? Food, clothes, shelter, and instruments of labor, and we have to produce those things. So just notice in the quote that we've got these two things: production and reproduction. Reproduction, of course, refers to like biology, right? Reproducing like actual people in children, families, communities, right? Humans, the species as a whole. So both of these are intertwined, and they change over time. they're not, oh shoot, that's not supposed to change it. They're not uniform, they're not timeless, there's cultural variation. And just as a little aside, this is actually a pretty wild claim, right? That the family has a history. For some people who are more conservative or traditionally minded, to emphasize the historicity of the family is automatically a kind of radical statement. But Engels is not alone here. Many different thinkers and writers for the last couple of 100 years have recognized that the family goes through, has different variations over time. And they might think of them as stages. We don't have to get locked into a stages account, but we can recognize sorts of differences, right? It does. So to think in terms of stages does not anchor us in a uniform trajectory or linear trajectory. It just lets us start to see like, oh yeah, different ways of arranging family life correspond to different kinds of economic relations. So for example, early societies, and by early, I mean, I'm thinking like, and Engels is thinking like 10,000 years old or 8,000 years old. Early societies rely on kinship groups. And in kinship groups, there is typically a sexual division of labor, right? That's for Marx and Engels both. That's the earliest division of labor is the division of labor between the sexes. And so this tells us that for, in historical materialism and for Marx and Engels, work and gender are mutually imbricated, right? That there is a sexual division of labor. It tells us that work and gender are deeply interconnected, right? They each contribute to how the other is formed. And this has been theorized and explored and developed much more by, particularly by feminist theorists in the last 30, 40 years. But typically, early societies rely on kinship groups with a sexual division of labor. The rise of property and exchange leads to more and more complex societies that are structured around classes and around the conflict between classes, which is usually a conflict between those who do the work and those who want to claim the products of this work. So the basic idea is that over time, the family unit is no longer the economic basis of society. There can still be families, but their economic function changes. Right? Like we see this super clearly in the rise of industrial capitalism, where the family changes from a unit of consumption, from a unit of production to a unit of consumption. Right, prior to industrial capitalism, most of the goods that people needed in their everyday life were made within families and kinship communities. I think of canning or preserves or clothes or small tools. And then as candles, soap, that kind of thing. And then as industrialization gets going, then these things become commodities that are purchased in a market. And so the family changes from this unit of production to a unit of consumption, and that there's a corresponding devaluation of household labor and women's labor since there was a sexual division of labor. But the bottom line here in this, just thinking through Engels' emphasis on the production and reproduction of the immediate essentials of life, the bottom line here is that how society is organized is a matter of the development of labor and the family, production and reproduction. Historical materialism looks at history in terms of this development. Okay, so this is our method, the historical materialist method. I'm now going to shift to thinking about pre-capitalist labor. And I'm drawing in my remarks here from Marx's writing in the Grundrisse. I didn't put this in the assigned reading because honestly, it's like super long and really it's The details are scattered throughout different parts of the book, so it's not easily summarizable or excerptable. But there's a short book called Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations that is an edited version that people might be interested in looking for. So if you really like thinking about Marx on the development of capitalism and pre-capitalist formations, check that book out, Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations. So what's going on in this analysis is that Marx is painting a picture of labor before capitalism. He's basically carrying out a kind of thought experiment about what capitalism has to negate in order to take the form that it does. Right? There's some presuppositions that capitalism has, and it has to negate particular things to take the form that it does. And so his account of pre-capitalism is really mostly a thought experiment in the Grundrisse more than it is a history. He just presents it as a history. One of the things that's crucial to keep in mind is that capitalism does have a history, right? We have not always and everywhere been capitalist. It emerges, and it can also, and it can also go away, right? Capitalism has a history. It's a finite entity. It started and it can end. So that means that, and so thinking then about this pre-capitalist history means that we can recognize that there were productive relations before capitalism developed. People produced and reproduced themselves and their communities in non-capitalist ways. People produced and reproduced in ways that secured their basic needs, right? The immediate essentials of life, and that met social needs. So they did this in a non-capitalist way, a pre-capitalist way. And capitalism comes out of these relations and it transforms them. So what we want to do is take a look at what these pre-capitalist labor relations look like and the forms that they took. Now, Marx in the Grundrisse posits an original unity of the producer with the land, an original unity. This unity is mediated by membership in a community. So what we have is this ancient communal form where the producers are proprietors, right? It's theirs. A group of people, typically a kinship group with slaves and or servants, a group of people works the land and produces what they need to survive. This group and its relation to land are the prerequisites for the work of any individual. Right? They're the presuppositions of any individual work. They're just present as like a primary fact of existence, right? Nature, social group, earth, commune, right? They're just they're the objective conditions for the producer's reproduction. The producers only reproduce if they produce, and they only produce if they reproduce. So in this originary condition, right, of this kind of primary unity of a kinship group and their slaves or servants working the land, producing their social relations and their means of subsistence. Here, Marx says it's actually really the community that is the force of production. So this story then, it's not one that we're accustomed to, where an individual has to go and find themselves a job, right? An individual leaves the family and is goes out and looks for a job in order to survive, right? Sometimes like having to move to entirely different countries in order to make enough to survive. It's a totally, this original kind of pre-capitalist condition is completely different. Work and social relations and subsistence are already given. They're already present as the life of the community. It's not like, oh, I have to go get a job or I will starve to death. It's like, no, you're already in a community where you are working and eating and surviving and interacting. So again, to reproduce themselves, the proprietors or the folks in this pre-capitalist community, they engage in production. And through production, they reproduce themselves and their social relations. In turn, this production works back on the proprietors. It changes them and it changes their social relations. For example, as the community increases, the community clears more of the wilderness or natural area around them, right? They cultivate more land. So this is a changing of their natural and physical environment, just as they grow. The need for more land can propel conquest and colonization, Marx tells us, right? And so it's important to note here that colonization precedes capitalism. As communities increase in size, the strength of the ties between members decreases or weakens, right? Social ties weaken. And the urban environment starts to separate from the rural one. So towns emerge. And as towns emerge, we have the development of artisanal craft labor. And with artisanal craft labor, the craftsman or the crafts worker starts to have property in the instruments of labor, right? So owning the instruments of labor, right, the special tools to make the crafts, that becomes distinct from landed property, right? You can tell the difference between sort of the tools of a craftsman and then the land that the rural community works. Just as property in land is presumed to belong to the producer, right? That's the original community there. So is the craftsman assumed to have property in his own labor, right? The craftsman owns his own labor, and the products of his labor are also assumed to be his. Like, I've made, I don't know, what do we make? I make the horseshoes and the swords and the pots and pans, whatever I'm making, if I'm a black coppersmith or something. And these belong to me because I'm making them. So what I make as an artisan is mine to do with what we will. And finally, just as the commune, right, the original community, is the social basis of landed property, so is the guild the communal basis for artisanal property or property in labor. So both of them presuppose a set of social relationships. In this pre-capitalist originary condition, producers have the means of subsistence in their possession before they produce. They have their means of subsistence before they produce. They have food, they have shelter before production starts. The producer's not waiting to see if someone's going to pay him, to see if he can live, right? And this is true both for people working the land and for the artisans. How come? Because the artisans are in guilds. Right? Marx says that these journeymen in guilds, they're apprenticed to a master. Like, they're not independent workers trying to go out and like earn a wage. They're apprenticed to the master, and they share in whatever proceeds come to the master from the master's work, just like kids get the proceeds of their parents' labor. Differently put, the guild master's consumption fund supports the apprentices that work under him. The rise of artisanal labor and property in the instruments of labor continues the loosening of communal ties. And it makes the very sense of the community start to change, or the very understanding or view of the community starts to appear differently. Community starts to appear to be something that's not kind of natural and spontaneous, but actually is something that is itself a product of labor. Marx argues that because the element which constitutes property, the tools or the instrument, because the element that constitutes property is posited by labor, the community itself appears as made, produced by the worker himself. It's like, oh, we're the ones who are making our community, right? So it's not, so the community starts to be not just given, but something that we make, and we make together. So just like guilds are created by the co-workers or the people who have the same craft ability. And so an emergent feature then of this, rise of urbanization and craftswork, the guild system starts to appear as the product of the worker owners, and communities more broadly start to appear as the product or creation of those who are in them. So this is all this kind of gradual process of change that happens via the production and reproduction of the essentials of immediate life. Now, even in, as I've already mentioned, right, with this slavery and servant business, this ideal, even in this kind of mythic version of an original unity, not every worker or not every producer is a proprietor, and not every worker is an owner. Marx describes slavery and serfdom as secondary but logically necessary results of property based in communal labor, right? This early forms of subsistence labor. They exemplify the development and decay of these originary relations. Like reminding us that, look, even in this original condition, it's not static, right? Marx always thinks in terms of change over time. Historical materialism is always attuned to the way that changes in quantity become changes in quality. Right? They're always changing. With respect to slavery and serfdom, Marx writes, one part of society is treated by the other as itself merely an inorganic and natural condition of its own reproduction. If anybody's read Aristotle, remember Aristotle talks about the slave as just the extension of the master of the body. And Marx had read Aristotle. So from the perspective of these proprietors, slaves and serfs they're no different from land, animals, or tools. They're part of the natural set of givens. They're part of what the proprietors take for granted as necessary for their survival. Marx says, what we have here as an essential relation of appropriation is the relationship of domination. These relationships of domination do not deprive slaves and serfs of means of subsistence, right? Slaves and serfs have shelter, they have food, but this food and this shelter belongs to someone else, right? So slaves and serfs are both means of subsistence, and they partake of another means of subsistence, of another's means of subsistence, right? They're part of the means of subsistence for the kind of masters, and they are themselves, partaking of the master's means of subsistence. So for Marx, they don't contradict this originary unity because of this way that they're extensions, and they remain tied to the labor of the land. They remain tied to labor and the land. At the same time, they're an important element of negativity and change, and demonstrate how this original unity is always in the process of becoming something different, something more. And this negativity then helps us start to see what become the conditions of possibility for capitalism. The premise of capitalism is that the whole, right, the originary unity, dissolves into its parts. Work and ownership separate from each other. The proprietor of the land no longer works the land. Those who work the land no longer own it. Craft workers stop owning the instruments of labor. The tools employ them. As Marx says in Theories of Surplus Value, the means of production, the material conditions of labor, instruments of labor, and means of subsistence do not appear as subsumed to the laborer, but the laborer appears as subsumed to them. He does not make use of them, but they make use of him. Although serfdom and slavery also appear under capitalism, the capital relation itself posits their negation. The capitalist doesn't own the workers' labor power, he purchases their labor power. So, historic processes of reproduction generate conditions that separate producers from the means of subsistence that sustain them. Right? The conditions start to change. They're historic processes. And then once separated, once producers are separated from their means of subsistence, this lack of property in land, this lack of property in the instruments of labor forces people to find other ways to access what they need to survive. With the coercive authority of the state blocking some avenues of acquisition, right? Like you can't just take what you want, right? The state will imprison you if you do. Many then turn to the wage, meaning many have to sell their labor power in order to have the funds to purchase what they need to survive, right? They don't have the land anymore. They don't have instruments of labor anymore. What do? To survive, they turn to the wage. They sell their productive labor power. And they sell this for the sake of exchange, right? They sell it so that they can get money to exchange in order to get goods. So rather than embedded in a communal world where the objective conditions of production are taken for granted as given, right? Land, raw materials, tools, means of subsistence. Workers now find all of these as external to them. They confront them as alien and external to them. So the conditions are present, right? Means of production, raw materials, tools, means of subsistence. They're all present, but now in another form, Marx says, in the form of a free fund in which all political relations are obliterated. He means all social and communal relations are obliterated. The objective conditions of labor now confront these unbound, propertyless individuals only in the form of values. And I'm going to talk more about value, self-sufficient values. So labor's conditions lose their character as elements of communal life, and they lose their character as elements sort of premised on direct forms of domination, like serfdom and slavery. And they become, and the personal kinship relations, they become separated out from the workers. And they're available to purchase, right? You purchase means of production, you purchase means of subsistence, you purchase labor power. So everything was present from the original unity, but now in a different form. Everything is separated out and now only comes together through the mediation of the market. As Michael Denick says, capitalism begins not with the offer of work, but with the imperative to earn a living, dispossession and expropriation, followed by the enforcement of money, taxes, and rent. Such is the ideal of free labor. Okay, so now we see like what are the basic conditions of capital, right? Like the worker has to sell their labor power to survive because the basic means of survival are no longer immediately present and given. So now let's look at work under capital. Okay, there's our nice factory picture. And we'll start talking about this. As I mentioned from the outset, labor is not just what one person does, right? As if we could even think of an individual in a vacuum, right? As if we ourselves were not products of the work of multiple other people, like arranged in historically specific patterns. Any specific job or tasks, any specific job or task is but one moment in the broader expanse of the mass of human labor, right? The social substance. Labor is a relationship. And so it's helpful to think about these relationships. As we've already seen, in the original form, we had relations of master-slave and lord and serf. And now capitalism adds in a further set of relations. We can use these terms pretty much interchangeably. The relations of worker-employer, bourgeoisie proletariat, or labor capital. So I'm going to kind of talk through these terms. The worker in this Marx theory of labor under capital, the worker is the one who sells their labor power to another for a wage. Why do they sell their labor power for a wage? Because they have to. They lack means of subsistence, and they need the wage to buy these means of subsistence. And so the worker or the proletarian is the one who has to sell their labor power to survive. Now, does this mean that all work under capital is waged work, or that it's the presence of the wage that makes something work? That answer is no. There is, and Marx is explicit about this, he recognizes this, there is also unwaged labor, even under capitalism. This unwaged labor takes many, many forms. Slavery, volunteer labor, labor within the family, subsistence labor outside the wage relation, and so on, right? But there is unwaged labor under capitalism. So we can note then that the very notion of waged labor introduces a whole set of different categories and oppositions, right? So we've got worker-employer, waged, unwaged, and then labor time, free time. And these are all separated out, though in the original pre-capitalist time, they were unified, but now under capital, they're all separated out. I mean, this doesn't mean that people in the pre-capitalist originary version only worked, or that they were working all the time. The point rather is that they didn't approach work in these specific kind of hourly times when my work belongs to someone else, right? They didn't distinguish their work from other sorts of social activities necessary for the community that they were involved in. They didn't measure it out. So under capital, though, we get these separations: worker, employer, waged, unwaged, labor time, free time. So let's keep looking then at this wage relation where the worker sells labor power to a capitalist. The capitalist is the one who owns means of production. And y'all, just for the sake of making it easy, I'm going to use the pronoun he for the capitalist. Most of the time for a worker, I'll use she or they, but I think it gets tricky if I use too many plural pronouns to follow the references. So I'll say he for capitalist just for the sake of ease. So the capitalist owns means of production. He purchases labor power in order to employ workers to use these means of production to make commodities that he, the capitalist, will sell to make a profit. So the capitalist buys labor power from workers who have to sell their labor power. And the capitalist buys it, not out of the goodness of his heart, but because he wants to make money. And he wants to make money by employing the workers to make commodities that will belong actually to the capitalist, who will sell them in order to make a profit. So where does the profit come from? The profit comes from the workers, from the value that the workers' labor generates. The workers generate more value than they receive in compensation. So I'm going to explain how this works. But the basic idea is that the workers generate more value than they receive in compensation. This extra value is what Marx calls surplus value. This is what the capitalists claim as their own. And this surplus value and this generating of surplus value is what Marx calls exploitation. So exploitation is this generation of surplus value by workers that the capitalists take as their own. Okay, so how does this work? So in the production process, workers create value. This means that they add their labor to raw materials to produce not just things that are useful, right? Not just things that meet needs, but things to be exchanged. Things that can be exchanged in order to, things that can be exchanged for other things. This producing of things for exchange is how we start to get into surplus value. It's going to be this extra that's the capitalist source of profit. The capitalist pays workers less than the value of what they produce, and he takes that surplus for himself. So they're not just doing necessary work, they're doing surplus work that is the source of the profit that the capitalist will take for himself. So I've been talking about value producing labor. When Marx is analyzing the capitalist mode of production, this is the kind of productive labor that most concerns him, right? Value producing labor, labor that's producing surplus value. This is what he's most concerned with, though he does mention unproductive labor. That is labor that does not produce exchange value. So Marx is preoccupied, he's focused on productive labor, but he also mentions unproductive labor, labor that does not produce exchange value. Lots of necessary labor is actually not productive labor because it does not produce value, as in this exchange value. Necessary labor and productive labor are not the same thing. For example, taking care of a child is usually necessary, but it's not productive. Now, it can be made productive if a capitalist sets up a business where he employs workers to take care of children. So that could be productive, but even babysitting for pay is not value producing because the parents are just consuming childcare as a service. They're not employing child carers as part of a business in order to generate surplus value. So childcare labor is necessary, except in this one instance of a capitalist concern, it's necessary, but unproductive because it's not expended to produce surplus value. So what about, let me see if I have a, I think I had an unproductive slide here, or not an unproductive slide, but a slide about productive and unproductive labor. Let's see that, yeah. So what about then unnecessary labor? So I've talked about unproductive labor, right? There's a difference between productive and unproductive. Then what about necessary and unnecessary? For Marx, unnecessary labor refers to surplus labor, labor that was not necessary for the worker to survive, but was done to produce the surplus that the capitalist takes as his own. So weirdly, capitalism is a system that tries to get a lot of unnecessary labor out of us, a lot of surplus labor, because it's the surplus labor that's the source of profit for the capitalist. We could say then that the issue of work under capitalism is that the coercion comes in from how surplus or unnecessary labor takes over or trumps necessary labor. I'll say this one more time. We could say that the issue of work under capitalism is that the coercion comes from how surplus or unnecessary labor takes over or trumps necessary labor. Our work doesn't go to producing and reproducing the immediate essentials of life. It goes to producing surplus value and reproducing the capitalist system. There's one last set of ideas I want to introduce before moving on to the last part on imperialism. And this last set of ideas concerns value and how we know what the value of labor is. This is important for the theory of surplus value and exploitation. And the fast answer is time. How much time does it take to produce labor, right? So value has to do with what the cost of its production. So when we think about the value of labor power, we think about the time necessary to reproduce the worker, how much it costs to meet the worker's basic needs. Necessary labor time then refers to how much time the worker would need to work to produce the value she could exchange for the goods she needs to survive. So necessary labor time refers to how much time the worker would need to work to produce the value she could exchange for the goods she needs to survive. Let's see if Marx uses the expression socially necessary labor time. This is important because it names the fact that when we talk about necessary labor, like what's necessary for the worker, this is historically and culturally variable. If we just think about clothes and food, right? Like we start to recognize like, oh, what's necessary? What kind of clothes are necessary? What kind of food is necessary? Cooked food, raw food, healthy food, fast food, right? We can start to add in shelter and transportation and communication. What's necessary to survive changes over time. Right? It changes culturally, it changes historically, right? We might not think that a phone and a car are necessary, but in so many instances now in today's world, it's impossible to be employed without them. Like just one example, if your job is flexible, you have to be able to come in at a moment's notice. So if you don't have a phone, you can't get that job. And if you can't get that job, you can't pay your rent. Or the same thing, if like, given how bad, I'll just use the US as one example, though I think it applies to other places as well. Our public transportation is really, really bad. And so what happens if a worker lacks a car and can't afford a place close to work, right? And they can't rely on public transportation, right? They're really, they're basically screwed, right? A car becomes a necessity of life when there's no kind of adequate public transportation and when rents are too high to live near your workplace. So what's important here is just to recognize that socially necessary labor time is historically and culturally specific. When people are dependent on a wage to survive, what it takes to access a wage depends on a wide array of factors. Right? So this is actually moving into a second point. Like our dependence on a wage subjects us to a whole set of other kinds of coercive mechanisms. For example, to get a job, you might have to look a certain way, or speak a certain way, or conform to particular race and gendered expectations that are associated with a particular job. Right? Your manner of speech, your manner of dress, right? These will have to conform to the kinds of biases and bigotry that that an employer or that a workplace or an entire job sector has. You can also, when we think about our wage dependence, we can also recognize like, oh, like legal systems play a role here. Legal systems might bar some people from particular jobs. Like, let's say if you are Palestinian in Israel, you may not have access to all jobs. If in the United States under Jim Crow apartheid rules, if you were Black, you could not have particular jobs. There were years and years when women were barred from certain jobs. So, all of the conditions of employment, when we are dependent on a wage, subject us to a whole series of coercive relations. We can even start to think about borders and national borders, right? What about migrant workers and seasonal workers? How are they able to access wages? So to sum up then, this condition of labor under capitalism, I've emphasized capital and labor as two different sides of this relation that fragmented and separated and was fractured from the original one. I've emphasized waged and unwaged labor, productive and unproductive labor, necessary and unnecessary labor, and ended up talking about the value of labor and socially necessary labor time. Under capitalism, these are separate categories. They're separate ways of understanding work that appear in different combinations. At their core is the insight that labor is a relation, that labor is a source of value, and that under capitalism, this value is produced in a relation of exploitation. So I'm going to end this up by linking this discussion of work under capitalism to imperialism. Recall from the points regarding the pre-capitalist originary unity, colonialism and conquest precede capitalism. This tells us that even in this kind of hypothetical history, this history that's really just an analytic for figuring out what capital presupposes, and the weird separations that make capital possible. Even here, there's inequality between groups, not just within groups, but between groups. Some people are conquered and colonized. The international sphere isn't smooth. It's not like an equal playing field. Historical materialism doesn't begin in the Garden of Eden. It starts with how people produce and reproduce their conditions of immediate life. And it recognizes that this involves relations with nature and the world, relations that are differentiated in terms of the division of labor and in terms of hierarchies within and between groups. The division of labor is international, and it's a product of histories of colonialism and conquest. The form of conquest that comes out of capitalism is imperialism. Imperialism is the policy of finance capital that develops out of industrial capitalism. in the context of the kind of war of capitalist competition, right? Different capitals compete with each other. There's a national concentration as well as an international division of labor, and this competition is what engenders imperialism. In his analysis of the colonial territorial division of the world prior to the First World War, the Bolshevik theorist Nikolai Bukharin observed that it is in the colonies that all the blood and the filth, all the horror and the shame of capitalism, all the cynicism, greed, and bestiality of modern democracy are concentrated. Bukharin continues and connects this point directly with work. From the perspective of this imperialist moment, the winners in this imperialist moment, the winners are US, American, and European workers. The exploitation of pre-capitalist producers and colonial labor led to the rise in the wages of European and American workers. Now, Bukharin explains this, right, that the winners in imperialism are European and American workers. He explains this in terms of a world struggle over surplus value. Just like in the national instance, so in the international, do the stronger competitors get more profits, right? They get super profits. Now, why are they stronger? Is it because they're somehow like super great capitalists? No, they're stronger because of military power, location, sometimes the organization of production, but really their strength comes from their ability to force terms of exchange on others. Imperial countries can suppress the value of labor in the colonies, and we would add today neo-colonies. It's like the socially necessary aspect of labor time gets depressed and diminished, right? Degraded and disrespected through imperialism and colonialism, right? What is socially necessary for the life of the colonized is made to be less than that of people in the imperialist countries, even as there's differences among the imperialist countries. So imperialism suppresses workers' consumption levels. It pays them less than the value of their labor, and it uses them to extract ever more surplus value. Necessary work, right? Work necessary for social reproduction can elude the capitalist wage relation altogether under imperialism, even as capitalism relies on it. Hence, the piece that was suggested that folks read from Denning, right? He evokes wageless life. So imperialism suppresses workers' consumption, paying them less than the value of their labor, and using this to suppress, to extract more surplus value. So just to sum up then, and then we'll go into questions, what we've looked at is how labor is a relation that changes over time, how labor under capitalism presupposes a set of divisions that force the worker to sell her labor power to survive. And we've concluded by recognizing like, oh, this happens in the world economy as imperialism. So I'm interested in y'all's comments and discussion, and I'm going to stop the screen share.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was really engaging lecture. I do want to open the floor now for questions. So please feel free to directly ask.
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. Very dense and very, fluid and engaging. My question was about the question of the importance of land in the eras, as you call them, pre-capitalist and capitalist. And it's not exactly an objection, is that I think that the role of land actually has become even more important because capital, like artisans, need allocation. So all your fancy tools, you wouldn't be able to do anything with them unless you have the location. And I think that's why the land is the dominant and the linchpin of both pre-capitalist and capitalist economics.
We're taking several remarks, Tanya, is that right?
Yeah.
Hi, Professor Din. Thank you for the presentation. It has been very engaging. So my question is also passed in the chat is about what has been called bullshit jobs. So as you said, the capitalist tries to get the most unnecessary labor out of the workers. And I was wondering if that was not the generation of use value is not the only motive for this. If also there is a way for keeping distracted people, giving them imaginary work to do in order them not to think, to keep them like a domination by distraction. And that is what has been called by someone else bullshit jobs. And I would like to know what your take on this is. Thank you.
Hi, I think I'm next. Hi, Jodi. This is Purnima. I don't know if you remember me, but we met in Chicago a month back. So lovely to hear this. Lovely to hear your talk. My question was around how do we think about, I mean, the current conditions of how labor is playing out and the way in which companies and corporates like Uber and others are absorbing labor in a way, in the language of flexibility and giving back ownership of your work to people. So they're flexible to do whatever they want and they can do this labor at their own time, and almost also using language of unalienated relations, right? Like we are partners, you're not my worker. So how do we, given this picture of how capitalism moves and is absorbing labor in our current moment, I was just wondering if you could reflect on that a little bit and tracing it historically, how you've just laid out the land historically. Thank you.
Awesome. These are great questions. I'll go ahead and answer or respond to these three, and then we'll keep hearing from other folks. So all of them are great. The first one with the continued primacy of the question of land, I don't disagree with that. I think that that's really important, and that it's also one of the reasons that being sure to move beyond Marx to the kind of analysis of imperialism that comes in with Lenin, the Bolsheviks, the Third International is so crucial, is because it makes us have to keep in mind the presence of all different parts of the world where land is being actively taken in the interest of occupied, seized, annexed, and for the sake of capitalist domination and profit. So I think that it's important to to continue to emphasize the role of land. I also think it makes a lot of sense to emphasize land, because when we hold on to that, we can think about rent relations as well as the profit generating relations that are crucial to capitalist work, that rents are a different kind of profit. On the bullshit jobs, I love David Graeber's work on that. I think it's great. And I think the questioner was completely right to say that bullshit jobs bring with them like an extra economic kind of coercion that actually makes no economic sense, right? If neoliberalism was an economically efficient form, which they told us was, though obviously we all know that it was a lie, there would not have been this proliferation of bullshit jobs. But the bullshit jobs are there to actually make some people feel powerful and other people feel weak. They're there to create kinds of blocks. So what's interesting, though, is I think that Marx has this really wildly technical account of unnecessary labor, and Graeber's Graeber's account is doing different work. What Marx is wanting us to think about is like, oh crap, right? It's unnecessary labor that generates surplus. Right? That really necessary labor is the labor that meets basic needs. And what if we actually had a system that was where the work we did was just necessary work, rather than all of these forms of excess that are there for the sake of generating profit or generating surplus? So I think Graeber gives us a really important, he's an anthropologist, but I would say, or was an anthropologist, I'd say sociological analysis that's really useful. But there's this kind of cool technical feature in Marx's association of surplus value with unnecessary labor. On flexibility in the current conditions, what is so wild to me is how this flexibility means that workers are free from job security. And so it's a continued separation, just like we see in the Grundrisse, where the breakup of the originary unity. What we see now is a breakup of whatever kind of safety net, provision, security was present as a result of working class struggle from the 19th and 20th century, and workers are free from that, freed from employment relations, right? Freed from that structure, freed from social benefits. And to be a free and flexible worker means completely on your own, right? At the mercy of the app. So I think the current conditions are, they have a, they resemble a kind of new turn, where there's a dependence on things like in the originary condition, there's a dependence, but it's also one that's resulted from from a new kind of set of separations.
Thank you, Professor Dean, for that explanation. My question is about asking you to elaborate on the role of the migrant worker and the sort of physical extraction of their labor power from the periphery into the core, and their role of reproducing these means of existence in the core, and the racial disparities that exist in this process, whereby the worker is removed from their home country, that home country stays underdeveloped through, like, at the very upper level, brain drain, but even at a lower level. For example, I live in Canada. A lot of our food is what is like the means of subsistence is grown by migrant workers from that periphery to Canada, or imported from migrant workers who work in the US or surrounding countries. So sorry, just to quickly go, a lot of what we survive on is created by this group of people. So in a way, they reproduce the labor power of the workers in Canada, for example. So how do we explain their role in this separate level of social relation?
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation and explanation. My question is simple, it's just one sentence. Is social production categorized as unproductive labor? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Jodi. It was really wonderful. I want to tell you that I love your book, your intro to this. Really just made such a great difference in understanding. Okay, this a little, I'm trying to remember my question. When you talk about land and land as earth is one thing I'm curious about. Like, could you elaborate on, like, how does capitalism end when we've extracted everything from the earth? Like, what does, I know Marx has something to say about that, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on, like, how far does this go? Thank you.
Let's see, there's three really good questions, so I'll go ahead and answer them. Y'all, I'm sorry, when people start talking, like my screen like moves away, and so I don't get everyone's name, and so I'm having to identify his first, second, and third question. So apologies for that. If I was more adept, I would be able to change this around, but I can't. So okay, honestly, the first question gave the brilliant analysis of the relation between and the role of migrant workers and the use of their labor for producing the kinds of life that those of us in the imperialist core benefit from. I thought that was a really that it was a beautiful analysis built into that question. I think that you know, it's one of the things that I think is important is to recognize that this is it's not new, right? It's over 100 years old. We could even say several hundred years old. There's deep processes and histories of colonialism and then imperialism that have enabled these structures and created and de-developed countries and kept them in de-developed and undeveloped and underdeveloped conditions that have made it the case that that it's impossible under capitalist and imperialist conditions for the countries to ever catch up. That it was always that the idea of development was always essentially imperialist propaganda and set up in a way to continue to secure super profits for the capitalist and the imperial core and underdevelop the countries that were allegedly supposed to develop. And then the structural adjustment policies installed by the World Bank and the IMF in the 70s and 80s only accentuated that and continued to make it worse. And we know from the ways that all of the processes of when workers who are migrating are trying to get positions, the way that more and more of their wages are extracted through having to pay a fee for this, a fine for that, permissions for that, everything, like across the board. It's like there's going to be ever more money extracted for them. So there's actually no way that can ever be ever provide enough of an economic benefit for the actual countries that are educating the people, that are educating them, that are the locus where their families live, right? The money doesn't go back to them. So I think that the question really brought in a lot of the excellent analysis there on social reproduction and unproductive labor. So the first answer is no. Socially reproductive labor is not necessarily unproductive labor. It depends on how it's set up. So under capitalist conditions, the work of social reproduction is generally set up so that it's not productive labor, in that it's not producing items that are going to be for exchange. It's set up in ways that are simply reproductive rather than productive, but it depends on the larger context. I mean, this, as I'm sure people know, and it may have been mentioned in the chat, I mean, there's a huge debate among feminists around this. And Silvia Federici has a particular take on this, a particular angle on this. She really wants to emphasize that social reproductive, the labor, particularly unwaged care labor in the homes, that kind of socially reproductive labor is productive because it produces the laborer. I disagree. I simply don't think that creating children should be understood as the same thing as creating a commodity. I think that that concedes too much to capitalism. And in fact, that we get a better critique if we recognize how much capital excludes from productive labor the very things that it needs to survive. Or needs to, to reproduce the capitalist relation. Another way to put this, I may be talking too fast for the question, translators, let me calm down. Another way to put this is that capitalism turns a lot of work into resources rather than recognizing it and treating it as work. Okay, and then the last point on land as earth. So as the question suggests and alludes to, Marx recognizes this tense problem of the metabolism between work and land, and how nature is metabolized in the productive process. And he's completely worried about the ever expanding disjunction between the development of industrial labor and a proper relationship with the earth, or I'm using kind of earth, land, and nature a little bit interchangeably. Which it may not be great, but for right now, I guess it's okay. But Marx is concerned about the tension there. The solution, though, the answer is political. It's not going to be a kind of, oh, it happens, organically or naturally. It has to be political, where we recognize capitalism has a history. It's destroying it's just destroying the natural world, or it's destroying the planet, that where destruction means making it so that people and many other species can no longer survive or flourish. And so it's up to us to actually stop that and change that. So I think that recognizing the kind of metabolism crisis is crucial, and part of what what's entailed in making this analysis politically vibrant and useful for us today.
That's really well said. We do have one more question. Professor, do you have time? Okay, this is from Jan Will. Go ahead.
Hello, Jan from London. Thank you very much for that talk. Could you say something about the role of the trade unions? How many, in that they may challenge, undermine or collude with the society? And does this relate to your point about that the workers who benefited after World War I were Europeans and Americans? Is this because the trade unions were strengthening? Otherwise, I don't understand that point about World War I and our workers benefiting from it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so first of all, I think that we can say that you gave 3 different options, to work the unions. What was it? Support what were the 3? Can you say it again? What the 3 options were? Because basically, I think the answer is that they do all 3.
Oh, challenge, undermine, or collude.
Yeah, and it seems like historically we know that they do all 3, have done all 3, and are likely to continue to do all 3. We can say even the same union can do all 3 at the same time, because a union is a bunch of different people that will have different voices. And it could be that splits in the leadership, or splits between the leadership of the union and the sort of rank and file. All of these happen. So the first thing is, like, just like there's no pure party, there's no pure union. All of these things are going to happen with unions. one of the things that we know for sure that happened in World War I is that the unions did not, and the working classes in the imperial core became nationalists. They acted in a nationalist way. They didn't reject colonization. They didn't come out against imperialism, except, maybe some small ones here or there. But for the most part, the working classes engaged in the same nationalism as the, as their imperialist and nationalist leadership. So, the Marxist ideal has always been an international working class and the building of international forms of solidarity, not failures of solidarity, because of, in a kind of nationalist fervor, or because of the working class in one country sees the benefits, say, of a strong arms industry, or sees the benefits of being able to make sure that the items that they make can be easily sold in other places and not subjected to kind of competition or something like that. So, so that's part of the point from the imperialist point that comes from Bukharan and imperialism.
Okay, I think we do have a lot of questions in the chat, but we're running out of time. I would think
Tanya, before you turn it off, or can you give me a copy of the questions? Like, because I don't know how exactly to do that. Just so I can see them. Okay.
And
I guess
please continue the discussion in the Telegram chat. All the questions. We'll send you the chat copy.
That sounds great.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know it was a weekend and early morning for you as well. But it was such a great, fulfilling discussion. I think I learned so much, and so much reading that I look forward to now after your lecture. And thank you for everyone to joining us today. I know it's really late for a lot of people. It's 10 p.m. for me here in New Delhi, so I can just imagine. So thank you so much, and we'll see you guys later next week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.